for the love of the awaited Savior of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi, Ajjalallahu ta'ala faraj al-Sharif, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين سيدنا الممجد بشير المصدق المصطفى الأمجد محمود الأحمد أبي القاسم محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد
وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين ولعنة الله على الظالمين من الأولين والآخرين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه المجيد وفرقانه الحميد وقوله الحق. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ولله ملك السماوات والأرض ويوم تقوم الساعة يومئذ يخسر المبطلون وترى كل أمة جاثية كل أمة تدعى إلى كتابها اليوم تجزون ما كنتم تعملون. هذا كتابنا ينطق عليكم بالحق إنا كنا نستنسخ ما كنتم تعملون. فأما الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات فيدخلهم ربهم في رحمته ذلك هو الفوز المبين. وأما الذين كفروا أفلم تكن آياتي تتلى عليكم فاستكبرتم وكنتم قوما مجرمين. آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم. Awaited Savior of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, my respected elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. First and foremost, as we are entering into the holy month of Ramadan, we thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for granting us this wonderful tawfiq. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the opportunity to be able to see the entirety of this blessed month, and especially manifest, maximize Layali al-Qadr, the nights of Qadr. Surely the greatest achievement of the Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, was his developing a very broken and disparate community. When the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi begins his prophetic mission, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a number of verses to describe the circumstances of that community. They were, according to Surah Al-Imran, living on a pit of fire, ready to plunge headfirst therein. They were a people who were wandering blindly in their intoxications. Yet, by the time the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa alihi has only but a few years with them, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals another set of verses praising that very same community, stating, Kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat linnas. You are the best of people that have been heralded for mankind. From here to here, within just a few years. The question, of course, comes, how? How did the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa alihi develop and build this community, taking it from on a ledge of pit of fire to being a community that is the greatest community that has been sent in the history of mankind? Our series, inshallah, over these 15 nights will be for us to be able to reflect on this question from the perspective of the Holy Quran, what is known as Tadabbur Mawdu'i. for us to be able to ponder and reflect on one subject from the Quran and to see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has spoken about and how He has introduced this particular subject for you and I. Whenever we take any subject matter, any theme within the Quran, this is known as either Tadabbur mawdu'i or Tafsir mawdu'i. Tafsir, of course, is when someone comments upon the Quran. Tadabbur is when one reflects and ponders upon the Quran. You and I will take a Tadabbur mawdu'i. We will take this one subject of how the Quran speaks to the topic of community building, community development. What are the foundations of a strong community? How does a community develop over the course of years and decades? And how specifically the Quran sheds light upon this particular subject. The first thing for us to be able to mention tonight is that there are a number of different ways in which a person can perform tadabbur or tafsir of the Holy Quran. Tadabbur mawdu'i, to take one subject, one theme, is just one way of performing tadabbur of the Quran. To be able to gather the verses of one particular subject and to be able to see that subject through that lens. It's just one way in which the Quran is approached. What are the different ways in which the Quran can be approached? How did Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam instruct us to perform our tadabbur and our tafsir? Who was the first person to introduce the technique of tadabbur mawdu'i, of a thematic commentary of the Quran? What are the different examples of tadabbur mawdu'i that we can find? And how is Tadabbur mawdu'i arguably the most profound way in which a person can perform tafsir of the Holy Quran? This is our subject matter for tonight, by way of introducing the topic that we will be discussing over these coming 15 nights, inshallah. Number one, what are the different styles, techniques of performing Tadabbur of the Quran? There are many different styles and techniques of tadabbur and tafsir of the Holy Quran. Each has their different benefit, and each has their own place within history of expansion upon the Holy Quran. Most common and the most famous is what is known as Tafsir al-Tajzihi, coming from the root word juz. When we recite a juz of the Quran, we recite a part of the Quran, a portion of the Quran. Tafsir tajzi'i is for us to be able to look at each verse and comment on it line by line, portion by portion. So we start with the opening verses of the Quran and we comment chronologically all the way from the beginning to the end of the Quran. We start with Surah Al-Fatiha and we end with Surah An-Nas. We start with Al-Fatiha, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, and we comment on it. And then we go to the subsequent verse, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. And we look at all of its issues, we look at all of the linguistic issues, we look at all the grammatical issues. We can see how Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam have commented on this. And one by one, throughout the entirety of the Quran, chronologically, we comment on the Quran. This is tajzihi. This is the most common way in which a person may comment upon the Holy Quran. And of course, this has its benefits. A person systematically gets to go through the entirety of the Quran. And so, in theory, nothing is missed. No verse is excluded by virtue of us reading through the entirety of the Quran. This is one way. A second way was the one which was made famous by His Eminence, Allama Sayyid Tabatabai, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh. Sayyid Tabatabai took the hadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, in which they stated إِنَّ الْقُرْآنَ يُفَسِّرُ بَعْضَهُ بَعْضًا. That the Quran comments on itself. So that the primary commentator of the Quran is whom? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Quran comments on itself. The Quran will explain itself for you. And so His Eminence Sayyid Tabatabai, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, took this methodology. Before looking at any ahadith, before looking at any other commentary to inform him of the Quran, the first thing is that he did, that he looked at where the Quran spoke about that particular issue. It might be another ayah, it might be a whole surah, it might be a particular word. All of this was used to comment upon the Quran. This was the second way. يُفَسِّرُ بَعْضَهُ بَعْضًا. Second way of performing tafsir or tadabbur of the Quran, to allow the Quran to comment on itself. A third way in which you and I can perform tafsir of the Holy Quran is what is known as the maqasid of the surah, where you look at the theme of the surah, the goals of the surah, and you say, this is the whole history of the surah. This is the way in which the surah speaks about these particular issues that are within the surah. A book has a particular theme, it talks about one subject. So you look at the surah and you say, what are the subjects being addressed within the surah? And then you comment on each verse in light of the theme of the surah. The theme of the surah could be anything. The theme of the surah could be economics. The theme of the surah could be justice. The theme of the surah could be anything. And then you see the ayat of the Quran in light of the overarching themes of the surah. This is a style of tafsir called the maqasid of the surah. Another style of tafsir or tadabbur is to take a particular science and try to understand a chapter through that particular science. So for example, science of sociology, the relationship between humans and societies within themselves and to others. And so when you're looking at the verses of the Quran, you're understanding them through a particular lens, or a scientific lens, for example, or a historical lens, or an akhlaqi lens, and so on and so forth. This is another style of tafsir. The fifth style of tafsir is the one that we are going to be focused on in this particular series, inshallah. And that is for you and I to be able to take one mawdu', one subject, and we pool together the verses regarding that one subject from across the entirety of the Quran. Our question we're going to be posing to the Quran is, how does the Quran speak about developing a society, developing a community? Such a question is most important for us. We have our immediate community here in Bab al-Ilm, Leeds. We have other communities in Leeds. How do we develop this community? And how does this community relate to the other communities surrounding it within Leeds? How does the city of Leeds develop in relationship to other cities? How does our nation, our world develop? We can ask this very same question from any other angle. How does the Khawaja community develop? How does the Pakistani community develop? How does it develop in relation to India? How does it develop in relation to any other community? And so on and so forth. All of these questions can be posed directly to the Quran, and that is going to be our study over these 15 nights. How does the Quran discuss these principles of development within a community? The second question we wanted to ask for tonight was, who was the first of the infallibles to make a clear demonstration on this technique of drawing disparate, multiple verses together from the Quran in order to answer a particular question? One might say, we don't need to draw from the Quran multiple verses. Who told us to do this? Who gave us the example to do this? And so if one of the members of Ahlul Bayt alayhimussalam have instructed us in this way, or given us the example of this way, then we know that this is the very best way for you and I to be able to perform Tadabbur and Tafsir of the Holy Quran. And so I bring an example, and you can see there's a number of books that we're going to be showing you tonight by way of introduction. This book I consider to be one of the most important books translated into the English language regarding the Holy Quran. It is called The Message of the Quran by His Eminence Grand Ayatollah Sheikh Nasir Makarim Shirazi. May Allah grant him a long life. This work, which is published by the World Federation, Ayatollah Makarim, he quotes a famous hadith from Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi. Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam, in this hadith, he is discussing the issue of kufr and shirk. Now, Imam could have very easily just given one definition of kufr and one definition of shirk, but the Imam didn't do this. The Imam went back to the Quran and he brought together a number of disparate verses from across the Quran in order to explain the different features of the word kafir. What happens often is that we Muslims, we make a very grave error. When we translate the word kafir, we give it one meaning. We give it one translation. We say the translation is disbelief. Or sometimes you'll see the translation infidelity. Or a person is an infidel. And so then the non-Muslim becomes as confused as the Muslim. The Muslim has misunderstood the word, and so when he or she relays it to the outside world, they become even more confused. And so they think that we are against disbelievers or infidels. We first need to go back to the Quran to see how Allah Jalla Jalaluhu has defined the word kafir. Not how you and I determine the word kafir. Allah uses the word kafir in a number of ways. And so in this hadith, what Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam does is he draws upon these multiple verses and presents them in accordance with the various meanings of the word kafir. So that when we see how Allah uses the word kafir, we don't provide it one meaning, we provide all of its meanings and we use it in accordance with the context that Allah uses it. What are those various different ways that Allah uses? We mentioned hadith. I'm quoting from this book, Message of the Quran. The first type of kufr is complete denial and rejection, which Ali ibn Abi Talib himself divides into categories. He says the first, for example, is the fundamental rejection of the existence of Allah, the existence of paradise, the existence of hell, the existence of Day of Judgment. This is one type of kafir. And then he quotes the ayah Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in Surah Al-Jathiyah, verse number 24, وَمَا يُهْلِكُنَا إِلَّا الدَّهْرِ. Nothing destroys us except time. We're going to be buried, our body will disintegrate, there's nothing more than that. So there's no afterlife. This is the first type of kufr. And then he mentions, alayhi salam, another example of kufr. He quotes another verse, this time in Surah An-Naml, chapter 27, verse 14. وَجَهَدُوا بِهَا وَاسْتَيْقَنَتْهَا أَنفُسُهُمْ ظُلْمًا وَعُلُوًّا. And they denied, they did kufr of the prophets unjustly and proudly, whilst their souls had actually been convinced of them. So another type of kufr is what? To know the truth, but yet to reject the truth. This is another type of kufr according to Ali ibn Abi Talib. The third type of kufr according to Ali ibn Abi Talib is that of sin and disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because when we disobey Allah, for a moment there is disbelief in us. Had we truly believed Allah had existed and had been present in that moment, we would never disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So how does Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam pull from the Quran? He gives us this verse. أَفَتُؤْمِنُونَ بِبَعْدِ الْكِتَابِ وَتَكْفُرُونَ بِبَعْدِ. Do you believe in a part of the book but do kufr of another part of the book? Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. A fourth type of kufr, according to Ali ibn Abi Talib, from the Quran is disassociation, bara'ah from someone. When you say, I do kufr, I deny and reject, of course, from one perspective, it can be negative. From another perspective, if I said, I do kufr of Yazid, this is positive, isn't it? I belie him, I reject him, I deny Yazid or Muawiyah or the others, and so on and so forth. Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam gives us an example of this. Kafarna bikum. I am completely averted away from you. I do kufr of you. In the example of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. In the fifth example, Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam says of kufr is by the meaning of ingratitude. Kufran ni'mat, to do rejection of the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he gives the example. لَإِن شَكَرْتُمْ لَأَزِيدَنَّكُمْ وَلَإِن كَفَرْتُمْ. And if you do kufr of Allah here, it doesn't mean to disbelieve, to reject, to deny the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلَإِن كَفَرْتُمْ إِنَّ عَذَابِي لَشَدِيدٌ. If you reject, if you're not grateful for my blessings, then surely my punishment is severe. Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam was the first to demonstrate this technique of bringing verses together about one subject in order to demonstrate the multiple angles of that subject. To show us how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala introduces, defines, discusses, expands upon that one particular subject. And so when we do this, we are following in the sunnah of Ahlul Bayt, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhim ajma'een. In the recent times, who is the first great scholar to reinstitute this technique of Tadabbur mawdu'i? As we said earlier, the person who reinstituted the technique of the Tafsir of Quran, ba'dahu ba'dan, that the Quran comments upon itself as whom? Sayyid Tabatabai, rahmatullahi ta'ala. Who was the first scholar to reinstitute the technique of Tadabbur mawdu'i in the modern era? After a long period of forgetting this technique, His Eminence, Grand Ayatollah al-Shaheed Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh. Shaheed al-Sadr was the first one to reinstitute this technique. In fact, he has written a particular work on it called Al-Madrasatul Quraniyah. And in this particular work, Shaheed al-Sadr, in the opening chapter, expands upon the technique, the importance, the role of Tafsir mawdu'i. And then he begins to enact this and actually provides an example of Tafsir mawdu'i. He takes one subject, the subject of the Sunan of Tariq, the different ways and laws that govern history. We often hear a famous statement: history repeats itself. That may be the case, but when we go back into the Quran, how does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala introduce the subject of history and its sunan, its practices, its ways, its laws to us? Shaheed al-Sadr, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, takes one topic and he looks at it from multiple angles from the Quran. What is the importance of studying history in the Quran? What is the relationship between history and us in the Quran? How does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala affirm the examples of history in the Quran? How do different stories relate to each other in the Quran? All of this under one study. This is an example of Tadabbur or Tafsir Mawdu'i, to look at one subject from all its angles from within the Quran. Since then, this subject, this technique has become ever more popular, where there are a number of scholars that have taken from the example of Shaheed al-Sadr, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh, and developed these numerous different subjects and themes. Why is Tadabbur Mawdu'i so important? The first reason, as we stated, it allows us to be able to bring one subject matter from a number of angles. Angles that we may otherwise not have thought of. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides for us one subject from a plethora of angles. In fact, one might argue an infinite number of angles. He states within the Quran, Surah Al-Kahf, verse number 109, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, قُلْ لَوْ كَانَ الْبَحْرُ مِدَادًا لِكَلِمَاتِ رَبِّي لَنَفِدَ الْبَحْرُ قَبْلَ أَن تَنْفَذَ كَلِمَاتُ رَبِّي وَلَوْ جِئْنَا بِمِثْلِهِ مَدَدًا. Say, if the sea were ink for the words of my Lord, and the sea would surely be consumed before the words of my Lord were to be exhausted, though we were to even bring more seas like that. The words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do not end. The angles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do not end. And so, when it comes to the subject matters that can be taken from the Quran, they do not end either. The second reason why Tadabbur Mawdu'i is so important, because it provides us with certainty. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us these particular matters, and so there's no room for doubt. La rayba fi, hudan lil muttaqin. Becomes a guidance for mankind. And thirdly, because we then get to see the relationship between these topics. At times Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will talk about different topics, we can bring these together. One subject matter might be economics in the Quran. Another subject matter might be community in the Quran. You can then bring these two subjects together and to see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about economic development of a community. And so on and so forth. All of these different topics are there. The last thing I want to be able to do to you is to demonstrate how this methodology has developed, where it has reached, and how it has become revolutionary for the Shi'i community in the way in which they approach the Quran. There are so many different books that have been written on Tadabbur and Tafsir Mawdu'i, yet we have only begun to scratch the surface of these topics, but also how much depth there is available to us when we begin to enter into this technique. I brought with me some examples of books that provide us with different titles when it comes to Tadabbur Mawdu'i. Mafhum al-Shafa'ah fil Quran. Just one topic, al-Shafa'ah. Intercession in the Holy Quran. One book dedicated to how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the topic of Shafa'ah. Another example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us one topic, the history of Banu Israel in the Quran. One topic. You know that the most often discussed story in the Quran is that of Banu Israel. So this particular book, history, testifies to the infallibility of the Quran. How? Because we have an accurate early history of the children of Israel. One subject matter explored from the Quran. Another example of one topic, coherence in the Quran. If you and I say that there is no mistake in the Quran, there's no ambiguity such that we can misunderstand, there is always a coherence when Allah refers back to verses of Himself. How do we understand the topic of just coherence in the Quran? This is one subject. Another example of one subject, al-aqsam al-Qur'ani, the oaths that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes in the Quran. وَالشَّمْسِ وَضُحَاهَا وَالْعَصْرِ وَالْفَجْرِ. One book dedicated to one subject matter. Quranic oaths, to understand how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala utilizes oaths. A much weightier, larger book, one can really stretch themselves with concepts in the Quran by Fathi Osman. One particular book looking at a number of different subjects that are mentioned within the Quran. Same thing, Tadabbur Mawdu'i. So he takes a topical reading, bringing many different subjects. Faith, how the Quran speaks of faith. Ibadah, worship, how Allah speaks about ibadah. How Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the Muslim society and the state. How Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about hudud and qisas and ta'zir. So many other topics, just topics from the Holy Quran. Another example, human development in the Quran. Embryology, one subject in the Quran. Qasas al-Quran, the stories that are mentioned within the Quran. All of these are just one subject that the book focuses on in order to be able to develop and maximize that theme. Our Maraji al-Kiram are beginning to move in this direction as well. When they study a particular subject matter, they themselves are beginning to now focus on pooling the verses together to speak about that one subject matter, to see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala introduces it, for them first to be able to take from Allah's words, and then to make sure that everything that they do follows on from that. Their understanding, their ijtihad, the way in which they check a hadith, the soundness of a hadith, is then in accordance with the picture that is being built from the Quran itself. I'll give you one example for us to be able to appreciate how there has become a shift in this direction towards the Quran, because this, of course, gives us a great example of the technique that is being used. This book is one of the most important books that is studied in the Hawza Ilmiya. It is by Shahid al-Thani, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh, who's written a wonderful commentary on fiqh issues. And in this particular work, he talks about the issue of najasat and taharat. And he's talking about mudaf water. Mudaf water is water which is mixed. It smells different, it tastes different, it looks different, the color is different. Are you allowed to use this water in order to purify yourself? To do tahara with? To clean something from your body or from your clothes? And of course, different scholars have different opinions. He mentioned Shaykh al-Saduq, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, has one opinion. He mentions Sayyid Murtada Allam al-Huda has another opinion. He mentions that the author of the book, Shahid al-Awwal, has another opinion. He has an opinion. And the central issue is a debate on a particular hadith. This hadith comes to us from our seventh Imam, Musa al-Kadhim, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi. Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam says the following. Well, someone came to him and said to him, Ya ibn Rasulillah, الرجل يغتسل بماء الورد ويتوضأ به للصلاة. Can a person do ghusl, or can he wash with rose water? Can he do wudu with it for his salah? So the question is about ghusl and wudu. A person who needs to be able to do ghusl or wudu, can they use water which is rose water? Rose water is mudaf. Its smell, it has a change to it. Its color may have a change to it. And so what happens? The fuqaha debate this hadith, the application of the hadith. Some use it, some don't. In here, the author says the problem with this hadith, وَلَكِنَّهَا ضَعِيفَةُ السَّنَدِ. It is a weak narration. It has a weak sanad. There's a problem in the chain of narration. So now the fuqaha don't know whether to use it or to use it. The matan, the text is one thing. The chain is another thing. Maraji' today are shifting the methodology. They are pooling together the verses of the Quran, concluding how the Quran speaks of a matter, and then verifying hadith in accordance with the ayat. This is a huge shift in the methodology of ijtihad. This is Tadabbur mawdu'i. This is to bring verses about one subject matter together. His Eminence, Grand Ayatollah Sayyid Muhammad Taqi al-Mudarrisi, in his ijtihad, Kitab al-Wajiz fil Fiqh al-Islami, he does this beautifully. He draws a number of verses about Tahara, 4 verses of the Quran regarding Tahara, and then he extracts conclusions from them, and then he will debate the hadith, not the other way around. He won't look at the hadith and see whether it impacts the mas'ala. The first thing is we create a Quranic picture of the topic, and then we look at the hadith. He brings 4 verses of the Quran. إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُحِبُّ التَّوَّابِينَ وَيُحِبُّ الْمُطَهِّرِينَ مَا يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ لِيَجْعَلَ عَلَيْكُم مِّنْ حَرَجٍ وَلَكِنْ يُرِيدُ لِيُطَهِّرَكُم وَلِيُتِمَّ نِعْمَةَ عَلَيْكُمْ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَشْكُرُونَ. Allah loves the Tawwabin, and Allah loves the Mutatahhirin, those who purify themselves. Allah doesn't want any difficulty upon you. He intends to purify you and to complete His blessings for you so that you may give thanks. وَيُنْزِلَ عَلَيْكُم مِّنَ السَّمَاءِ مَاءً لِيُطَهِّرَكُم بِهِ وَيُذْهِبَ عَنْكُمُ الرِّجْسَ الشَّيْطَانِ وَلِيَرْبِطَ عَلَى قُلُوبِكُمْ وَيُثَبِّتْ بِهِ الْأَقْدَامِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends down water in order to purify you, to remove from you your najasat, all your rijs, and in order to fortify your hearts. He brings verse after verse after verse, and then he draws a conclusion from them. Listen to what he says. وَحِينَ أَمَرَ بِالطُّهْرِ وَالنِّظَافَةِ فَقَدْ أَمَرَ بِالتَّحْقِيقِ الطُّهْرِ وَالنِّظَافَةِ بِكُلِّ وَسِيلَةٍ مُمْكِنَةٍ. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded us for purity and for cleanliness, Allah ordered it that we establish purity and cleanliness in any way that is possible for us to achieve it. This is how Allah speaks about it in the Quran. He introduces it holistically, purity and cleanliness. بِكُلِّ, from each, وَسِيلَةٍ مُمْكِنَةٍ, in every way possible. فَلَوْ عَلِمْنَا بِأَنَّ مَادَّةَ مُطَهَّرَةٌ تَنْزِيلُ الْخَبَثِ وَلَا تَدْعُ لَهُ أَثَرًا فَإِنَّ عَلَيْنَا إِسْتِفَادَةَ مِنْهَا لِتَنْفِيذِ أَمْرِ الشَّرْعِ بِالطَّهَارَةِ. So when we know this, that we are supposed to look for purification of khabath, of all the different dirts that might fall upon us, or different specific types of dirts that fall upon us. It is upon us to be able to benefit from the implementation of that with the religion stuff. Mathalan, for example, ad-dam, blood. الدم الذي تجمد على الثوب أو البدن إن لم يكن إزالة إلا بالصابون فعلينا استخدامه لإزالته. If dam, blood, hardens upon your clothes or upon your body, and there's no other way for you to be able to remove it but through soap, then it is upon you to be able to utilize that soap. Think about that. The hadith is debated. There's a hadith reaching us from Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam. Someone wants to use soapy water, rose water. Imam allowed them. But the hadith is weak because of the sanad. The mujtahid doesn't know whether to use or not to use. The methodology today is first look within the Quran. See how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala introduces, defines the subject matter, and then you will be able to verify the hadith of the back of it. Sayyid al-Marja al-Mudarrisi brings ayat after ayat, brings it together to show that from the perspective of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, any way you can purify your body, this is permitted with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now when you receive the hadith from Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam, which says you should be using or allowed to use a particular type of water, rose water, even though it's mudaf, Does it concord with the Quran or go against the Quran? It is in line with the Quran. This shows us how the Quran is being used today. How the methodology of ijtihad is evolving. How people are utilizing the Quran differently. All of this is for us to be able to use as the introduction for our series, continuing on from tomorrow night, inshallah. How does the Quran speak about the development of a community? When we bring all of these verses together, we'll be in the position to be able to see how Allah introduces this topic, and then we'll be in the position to be able to take this subject matter for ourselves from the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first, and then we can see the words of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam to expand upon that for you and I. This will be our subject matter and our methodology from tomorrow night, inshallah. Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله الطاهرين.
اللهم صل على محمد وعلى